Hello.
Our story begins inside the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. Grandmaster Yoda had just ended a transmission with Jedi Knights Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano. They were aiding Senator Amidala and Prince Lee Char on the water world of Mon Calamari. A civil war was brewing, and being fueled by the Separatist war machine. As Master Yoda ended the transmission, he turned and started walking out of the communication room. The war was sitting on his shoulders, and one of the other counselors present inside the room with him asked if he was alright. Yoda looked back at Saesee Tiin, who wore a noticeable concern on his face, and he nodded his head without saying a word. Yoda stepped out of the room, and Saesee turned towards Masters Windu, T, and Gallia on their respective holograms. They all knew that the war was eating away at Yoda, but maybe they hadn't realized how much damage had been done. The discussion focused on the Grand Master as he walked through the grand halls of the temple. For someone of Yoda's size, or simply a youngling, the temple was a wondrous place. It stood glimmering from carpet to pillar. Just staring up could be an incredible experience. Yoda, even in his late 800s, found some comfort and awe by looking towards the sky inside the temple. He had spent his entire life here, watched generations come and go. His life was full of instruction, peace, conflict, change, and desire to make right of every wrong that faced this powerful and courageous order. Yoda's eyes searched the expressions of those passing by him. There was still a sense of hope and optimism in their eyes, and even within their hearts. It brought tranquility to him as they continued to walk through the temple. Eventually he found himself stopped on a catwalk inside the Great Hall, just looking off into the distance. The Jedi Order had changed, and despite the positivity he felt from those passing by, from Padawans like Barriss Offee to masters like Jocasta Nu, there was a change that spread across the entire order. As a political and spiritual leader of this people, he had a responsibility to uphold. The pressure of 10,000 Jedi and trillions of sentience sat on his shoulders. He smiled quietly to himself, watching a couple younglings bounce across another catwalk below him. There was serenity in two knights, ones that were clearly friends, who walked side by side on the first floor. The ever-elusive Temple Guard unit was making a show of itself, with Master Syndralik in a corridor passing by quickly, so fast that Yoda only had a short glance at them before they were gone, and they were only walking. The temple was home, but Yoda felt called to reach out. Of course he did. His final student betrayed the Order and the people of the galaxy. Dooku was always a thought on Yoda's mind. He was someone who had the potential to become the best of them, given opportunities to join the council, and yet never found it within himself to rise to such an occasion. There was a clear disconnect between master and apprentice, and it happened long before Dooku ever stepped away from the Order. It dwelled on Yoda's mind for years, and he tried to make amends, but something had radicalized Dooku. Whether it was his connection and interactions with the Sith, or his desire to change something else, he didn't know. But that, perhaps, was the pain of having such a disconnect. Yoda's eyes were heavy, but he wasn't emotional. He scanned far from left to right, taking in the serenity of the temple and breathing it all in. Yoda had practiced this type of meditation for years, whether it be following the death of his first student or the death of his best friends, all of which coming naturally. Yoda had the distinct burden of training generations of Jedi, watching them all grow up and then be consumed by the Force through natural causes. The Grand Master stopped looking over the edge and turned to walk towards his own quarters. Just as he was about to make his approach, Master Tiin walked up to him and expressed that they had just uncovered information that he might find useful. Yoda followed along. The two of them didn't say much until they returned to the communication room. It was said that clone scouts accidentally captured sight of Count Dooku's solar sailor leaving the Zagirian system. However, this wasn't Dooku's first stop in hostile pirate territory. He moved south down the Permillian trade route to an ice ball in the middle of unclaimed hostile territory. Yoda looked at the map glow above his head. The clone commander, who Yoda had already seemed to forget the name of, explained that the solar sailor was tracked to the system of Ren Var. Mace Windu was still on the hologram, and once the trooper finished speaking, he spoke out, reminding everyone that Ren Var encountered a small piece of the war. Master Kenobi and young Skywalker fought a small skirmish on the surface, but historically, fallen Jedi Exar Kun trained his own fallen Jedi apprentice on that planet, before that student eventually was murdered. Mace quieted down, thinking to himself, as Master Tin took control over the conversation, explaining that the capturing and or killing of Dooku at this stage in the war could be the saving grace for the Republic. The CIS without his leadership would crumble, and there was absolutely no doubt that Gunray and the other separatist slugs would try to take control away from that government. Ayla Secura, who was now on the hologram with Commander Bly next to her, explained that even if the Council didn't make a move against the government, General Grievous was a loose cannon. No one knew if he was loyal to the Sith Lord or not, but chances are he would strike for more individual power against the likes of Gunray and the Techno Union. Yoda, still, sat in silence, thought on his decision. He, like Windu, was trying to figure out why Dooku would go to Renvar, especially after being on a planet like Zygeria. He'd be going from a former slave empire to the remnants of one of the most influential Sith before the Bainite lineage began. Of course, the Jedi were completely unaware of the resurgence in the Zygerian slave trade, hence why they didn't know a new slave empire was growing. Regardless, Yoda looked up, telling his peers to fetch him a shuttle. He would face down Count Dooku on Renvar and stop him. Master Windu asked if he would like reinforcements. Master Kenobi and Quinlan Vos were in the same vicinity, if he wanted another master to accompany him. Saesee concurred, expressing that he too could join him, and Yoda shook his head with a bit of sadness. This mission was his to face alone. He would do this with readiness. This was his failure, and he should be the one to correct it. In the case that Dooku survived their duel, he would appreciate a small escort to be ready to bring him back to Coruscant. Master Windu nodded his head, turning around and speaking to a commander on his Venator's bridge, and requesting an Arquentin's-like cruiser to rendezvous with Yoda over Renvar. Yoda shook his head again, expressing that the ship should arrive following his own landing sequence. Windu relayed these orders, giving an estimated time of arrival. The Grand Master, on the other hand, thanked every Jedi and clone present, including Saesee for his very appreciated support, but this was Yoda's burden. The Jedi around understood why Yoda felt so compelled to handle this on his own, but they were very emphatic that they supported Yoda no matter what. What he didn't know is that Mace was sending a Jedi Master to be inside the light cruiser, just in case. It would be Master Eth Koth, due to his ability to leave his position for this side quest. Yoda wasn't to know until the fight was over. Afterwards, Mace would bear the weight of any punishment that could arise from this. He was just making sure that Yoda had necessary backup just in case. When Yoda arrived outside of a blue and white orb in the middle of space, he began his landing sequence. The light cruiser from before would be arriving in the following 20 minutes. Yoda's green starfighter sped through the atmosphere, moving between bursts of sleet and ice, as he spun around a spire of sorts. There was an old castle on the planet. Yoda searched carefully for a landing zone. He then found Dooku's solar sailor and placed his vessel right next to it. Yoda considered destroying the ship but decided against it, despite his better judgment. The little green Jedi Master walked slowly towards the entrance of a cave or hole within this large, ruined castle. Time hadn't been kind to the remnants of Exarch Kun's apprentice. Yet, this still left another question for Yoda. Why was Dooku here? He ventured down into the cave, where he saw a beaming red light. There was a radiating noise that echoed across the chambers, but it wasn't heavy, just a steady humming, almost like a reverberating heart. Yoda peered around the corner to see Dooku holding a Sith holocron. It was slowly rising above his hand and opening. Little twists and turns creaked on the artifact as Dooku accessed it. He spoke into it, but he wasn't using the dialect of the Sith. He was using Galactic Common. Yoda found this especially peculiar, but he moved around to get a better view of what Dooku was doing. Then, all the humming and thumping stopped. Dooku, without looking in Yoda's direction, called him by name, and expressed that it was foretold that he would be here. This confused the Grand Master, but perhaps there was something that Dooku knew that he didn't. The fallen Jedi expressed that this prophecy would determine the rest of the Jedi history and what Yoda's Jedi lineage meant to the galaxy. This, again, didn't make a whole lot of sense. His former apprentice was speaking in riddles that seemingly had no real value. Dooku sensed this confusion and felt frustrated. Surely, Yoda was here for something more. What Tyrannus didn't know is this was a setup. Sidious knew that Dooku would buy a legend of a former Jedi turned Sith having died on Renvar as a relation to himself. Sidious planted a false prophecy and exposed Dooku's location to the Jedi. The clone that found Dooku and tracked him was placed there by Palpatine himself, simply moving pieces on a chessboard. The purpose for this setup, in Palpatine's mind, was to completely sever the connection between master and apprentice. Dooku had done a pretty decent job, but he wasn't fully committed to the role of Tyrannus in some aspects, especially after his betrayal of Asajj Ventress. This was ensuring that the transformation of Dooku was fully finished, so that when Lord Vader rose, there would be no loose ends. More or less, by this point in the war, there were some minor concerns of the potential that Dooku could betray the Sith, or even use his separatist military to wipe out the Republic and therefore Palpatine. There were certain situations in which Palpatine didn't want to navigate. He was protecting his loyalty by forcing former master and apprentice to meet. Yoda, without knowledge of this false prophecy of the Sith, told Dooku that he came here to end the war. He didn't know about this word of the Sith or anything of the sort. Yoda, in his heart of hearts, wanted Dooku to return to him. He couldn't come back to Coruscant or be a Jedi again, but he was tired of seeing Dooku destroy himself in the pursuit of nothingness. The Sith had nothing true to offer him, and he was continuously destroying himself out of desire for a change that wouldn't become reality. Tyrannus was obviously surprised that Yoda, after everything he had done, would try to make an approach to him to quote-unquote save him. Dooku found it quite endearing, but he had every intention to end this self-righteous pursuit of self-vindication. He believed that the only reason Yoda was trying to do this was so that he could make himself feel better. But Dooku planned on making sure Yoda died here on Renvar. His saber ignited, and Yoda's followed immediately. Dooku cut off Yoda in the middle of him trying to plead that he return to the light. All Dooku said is that it was too late for him. He dashed across the icy surface of the floor as Yoda lifted off the ground, swiping and defending. The cold ground of this ice-filled world would be challenging for Yoda, but he was actually wearing some kind of shoes for once. He tapped across the ground before jumping backwards, using the wall as a base before bouncing towards Dooku, who defended himself. Their blades clashed, igniting the chambers of the ancient Sith in red and green. Dooku dragged the blade across the ice, shredding it and dispersing it out across the room. Yoda landed on the tomb of the Sith apprentice. He watched Dooku raise his saber and slam down towards his former master. Yoda jumped back lightly, slipping on the ice of the tomb and falling backwards, just as Dooku split the actual coffin down the middle. Yoda used the Force to launch the coffin towards his former apprentice, but he slipped between it, dragging his blade down and attempting to kill Yoda. Their blades caught each other once more. Yoda was on the back pedal, using his defense against Dooku. Their duel on Geonosis was just a warm-up for the real deal here on Renvar. Yoda again used the walls to defend himself, as their blades continued to exchange blows. Tyrannus was impressive, but even Yoda could see that Dooku wasn't the same since Geonosis. His skills still rather remarkable, but the dark poison of the dark side was catching up to him. Compared to Yoda, it made his former apprentice's skills diminish rather rapidly. For someone like Obi-Wan and Anakin, it wouldn't be as noticeable, but Yoda could see it and he could feel it immediately. Just as he did with Yaddle, Dooku jabbed his blade aggressively, hoping to overpower his much smaller opponent. But Yoda had done this tussle before, especially with Dooku. Their duel carried on across the ice caves, shredding pieces of the walls and echoing out. Despite their duel only being held within the cave, within the castle, it was a booming array of noise. Yoda and Dooku continued to focus on each other, but outside, beyond the castle, there was a rumbling. The constant noise and echoing was causing the structural collapse of snow that had found home for itself for centuries. Yoda and Dooku continued to be oblivious to the rapid change to their environment beyond the cave. Tyrannus felt like he was seizing an upper hand, but Yoda was pulling him further in, so that he could defeat him and imprison him, because the last thing Yoda wanted was to extinguish Dooku's heart. Their blades rapidly connected until the castle creaked and cracked under the pressure of thousands of pounds of snow and ice. An avalanche cratered down, crushed into the castle and burying the former master and apprentice under thousands of pounds of weight. There was a quick disruption of their fight as they were both flung away from one another. They were so focused on their duel until the snow washed through, burying Yoda and throwing Dooku away from the fight. Outside of the caves, their two vessels were also covered in snow, but luckily one of the castle walls had protected the ships from being heavily damaged in the covering. Down below, under all the snow hidden by the cave, Yoda used the Force to lift himself out of his frozen state. He shivered under the cold, wet ice. He ignited his lightsaber and held it close to himself, to help build warmth, but also to see. With the oxygen now being limited, the fires burning were going to be extinguished. Across the chambers, Yoda could see Dooku's shadow rise as he called out to Yoda, demanding to know what he had done. Shame washed over the Grand Master as he explained to Dooku that he had to stop blaming others for the way things were. They were both in this predicament because of their duel, and they would remain down here until the end of it. Dooku directed his anger outwards and ignited his saber once more, telling Yoda that he would gut him and then escape. Yoda laughed a little because they both had lived full lives, and Yoda had no problem suffocating while keeping Dooku at bay, as long as it meant that the galaxy could be healed. Yoda expressed these thoughts vocally, and Dooku was forced to think things through. He, like Yoda, could feel the difference in his own fighting abilities since Geonosis, so in the very unlikely circumstance that he bested his former instructor, he probably wouldn't even get out of here. So Dooku asked Yoda if they could work together to escape, and Yoda responded, telling his apprentice that it depended. If Dooku had intentions to change, then he would consider it. However, it didn't matter to him in the end. If Dooku wanted to try and escape, he'd need to prove to Yoda that it'd be worth his time, because returning to Sidious's side wouldn't be worth his time, and he would happily die knowing that the Sith had one less asset. The Dark Apprentice didn't like being referred to as an asset, because he was something more. He believed that. He was an innovator of the future, but somewhere down below he didn't even believe that. Yoda told Dooku that there was only one condition that would get him out of here, and he needed to start talking now. The elder man watched Dooku closely from across the chambers, waiting for the condition. Yoda told Dooku that in the scenario that he was convinced, Dooku must banish himself to one of 3 planets, Ossus, Tython, or Tanu. From these 3 worlds, he'd be free to live without consequences for his crimes against the galaxy. But it would be in his absence that his crimes could be undone. This confused Dooku, because Yoda had truly come here with the hope that he could convince Dooku to return to him in some sort of aspect, or just join the light. Maybe not fully as a Jedi, but in some relation to the light, or the dark, where he didn't serve the Sith. Yoda simply wanted to save the galaxy, and maybe he didn't have it within his own heart to kill Dooku, but that was the burden for Yoda to bear. Silence sat between them for a moment, and Dooku asked what it was that Yoda wanted to say, and Yoda just sat down, looking across the room once more and extinguishing his saber. He had warmed up by this point, and he just closed his eyes and sat on the floor. Dooku tried numerous attempts, but he continued to talk himself into circles. The truth is, no one knew Dooku better than the Jedi who instructed him and watched him grow. So Yoda was allowing Dooku to get into his head and verbalize it. He tried apologies. He tried to make amends for different actions, but he couldn't get it. All the while, he was plunging his lightsaber into the snow, which was melting it, but ironically, more snow filled in where previous snow had been melted. There were a couple other things Dooku said, and he did try to save himself, but nothing could truly break Yoda's concentration or the snow walls that boxed both of them in. Tyrannus eventually stopped all of his movement, and told Yoda that he held some regret for what he had done. But at the end of the day, Yoda needed to look in the mirror. The fall of the Order, the rise of the Sith, corruption, and war was on his hands. Yoda listened and understood Dooku's frustrations, but he refused to speak until Dooku was finished. Tyrannus placed his hands into his sleeves and wrapped his hands around his elbows. He sighed heavily, confessing that what he did was out of desperation. He made his choices because Sidious gave him a choice. Yoda shook his head in silence, listening in heartbreak, but Dooku concluded his sentiment with the message that what he did was because of Yoda, because he had destroyed the Jedi and the Republic. They were all too bound to the Senate, and despite all of that, the Jedi Council constantly spent time around the Sith Lord. How could they not sense someone so evil, according to their mythology, sitting just across the table from them? Dooku then turned back to silence, as Yoda spoke softly, still in his riddled format. He told his former apprentice that those burdens had always sat on his own shoulders, but Yoda's role as Grand Master didn't make him the master of the universe. The Jedi worked in cooperation with the Senate because of the financial benefits that came of it. The Order, as an entity, wouldn't be able to operate without the financing of the Senate. Did it come with its shortfalls? Absolutely. But it didn't mean the Jedi never tried. Attesting 10,000 Jedi to the responsibility of quadrillions of sentience wasn't right or fair. The Order operated as an entity for the people, but Yoda wasn't going to make excuses for that. He told Dooku that he desired a perfect order, something that could never be. His friend Sifo Dyas believed in the Jedi Order. His apprentice Qui-Gon Jinn believed in the Jedi Order. Sifo Dyas' placement inside the ranks of the Council was one of selflessness, a path that Dooku as well could have contributed to. This wasn't blame, but the expectations Dooku had were always too vast, and yet at the end of all of it, Yoda was always present for Dooku. He had expressed that multiple times before, but Dooku always continued to neglect it. Maybe it was after he and Mace's mission to Raxus Secundus, or maybe it was after he and Padawan Jinn's mission to that one planet, but these moments of radicalization pushed him so far off his own balance. Did he really think Sidious wanted him to be a leader in this new coalition? What happened to all of his political power at the end of the war? What did he think would happen following Sidious's rise to ultimate power? Did he have a seat at the table? He'd be considered a war criminal for gathering together the Separatist forces. Because the Sith care about transition. The Bainite rule is about masters and apprentices, one who will replace the other. And if Dooku didn't plan on replacing Sidious, then who was his replacement? And that question could really go for Dooku and Sidious. Yoda explained that his apprentice, the good man that Jedi Master Dooku once was, had hurt him deeply. The code forbids attachments, but every Jedi understands the relationship shared between masters and apprentices. Dooku had hurt him deeply, but he still came here with the desire to save him. Would Sidious ever do that for him? Yoda left it at that. The hurt in his heart finally revealed, and Dooku wanted to enjoy it, because he knew he had hurt his master. But it didn't feel good like he thought it would. Realistically, Dooku had to understand that Yoda didn't control the Republic. He couldn't stop the democracy from becoming corrupt. He could only adapt to best protect his order. It wasn't perfect, and Yoda clearly knew it wasn't, because nothing would ever be perfect. This left Dooku feeling like he had wrongfully left the Jedi. It didn't mean he thought highly of them or wanted to change himself to become a Jedi, but something struck him about his future placement with the Sith. It always seemed like a no-brainer to him, but he hadn't truly thought about it, or even how quickly Sidious moved on from Maul, or betrayed Maul. His placement felt permanent, but in reality, there was nothing that certified that. Sidious checked in on Dooku's loyalty constantly, and Tyrannus couldn't do anything to make sure it was the same inversely. The two of them sat in an echoing silence, and Yoda told Dooku that he wasn't interested in killing him, and he wished it never had to be divided, but this was for the future of his order. Yoda too had issues with the Republic, specifically as Chancellor, but everything had to be done in moderation because 10,000 lives were always at stake. Dooku told Yoda that he would die for this, but Sidious was Palpatine. His body fell into the snow and he leaned into it, allowing its cold embrace to wrap around him. He told Yoda that he didn't want this anymore. There'd been a nagging feeling about this in his mind, about what Qui-Gon would do, and Master Kenobi had encouraged it on Geonosis. Yoda confirmed Qui-Gon may have not joined Dooku or the Sith, but he probably wouldn't have remained a Jedi warrior either. Maybe remain a Jedi, but that was very unknown. Yoda asked if he wanted to escape now, and Dooku just shook his head. He actually would prefer to die down here, with Yoda. Sure, there was the key to defeating the Sith, but there was no point in exposing either of them to the galaxy. Yoda actually was at peace with this, because he had saved his apprentice in some way, shape, and form. He could be content with dying with his final student, one who had foregone the way of the Sith, in its most basic form of rejection. They didn't have much to say for the rest of the time they were here. The two of them just enjoyed each other's presence, because it had been decades since the last time they had any sort of genuine connection like this. As the air started to die out, signifying the end of their time in this galaxy, a wall of water started to pool into the chambers. A light filled the room, and a couple clones called out, along with Eth Koth, asking to see if Master Yoda was still down here somewhere. Yoda's saber ignited, giving them all a chance to see him. The clones scanned the area as he told them that Dooku had been killed in their engagement, but he had been trapped down here in an avalanche. Yoda used the Force to pull Dooku's saber into his hand, and he requested that the clones transport him back to Coruscant immediately. Inside the chamber, Dooku watched the shadows of the clones and eventually Yoda walk out. Before Yoda left, he looked in the Dooku's direction, as if to say, he was free to go. The burden was no longer his. While Yoda was returning to finish his next mission, Dooku sat in silence, allowing the fresh air to wash over him, and he relished in it. When the sound of clone gunships left the surface of the planet, he found his way to his solar sailor and departed for Ossus, one of the planets that Yoda had mentioned. Before landing on the uncivilized planet, he would disable everything, so his signal would end on Ren Var, where the name Tyrannus died. Dooku would sit by the lake and look into the water, looking to find himself. Maybe he had gotten lost in the cycles, or maybe he had lost himself altogether. His face had aged. He had lost time of his life, but it wasn't ever too late to change. The following few days for Dooku would be grueling to say the least. He would struggle with identifying himself and truly comprehending who he had become. Dooku would become a ghost of the galaxy, and as the Jedi Counselors predicted, chaos would unfold behind Separatist lines. Being that this was only the second year of the war, a lot of the Separatist war machine was slowing down. Sidious was attempting damage control because what inevitably happened was a rush to power by the Viceroy and General Grievous. The Neimoidians had been powerhouses for so long that the idea of them not being next in line was unfathomable. A rapid collapse of the Separatist military unfolded, and before Sidious could truly get it under control, the Jedi put a hit out on Palpatine. It was a series of intentionally failed assassinations that inevitably led to Palpatine's disappearance. The play by the Jedi was Palpatine getting cold feet and running away from politics with a weak backbone. That wasn't obviously what happened, but it was a simple move that would remove him from martyrdom and ensure that the next political leader had some semblance of strength for the Republic. It worked perfectly too, because placing Palpatine into a predicament where he was nearly killed in a number of days multiple times made the job of Chancellor a genuine threat to anyone that wanted to be one. How the Jedi orchestrated Palpatine's downfall mirrored the internal collapse of the Separatist regime. Their government was awakened to the fact that their military was a part of the same conglomerate scam that forced them away from the Republic. They all learned rapidly that the Confederacy was a knockoff version of the Republic, the only difference being how good of a smooth talker the leader was in their eyes. How Dooku conducted himself influenced the masses to rebel against the Republic, but now the actual government realized that their fight wasn't with the Republic per se, because they were in fact themselves the smaller version of the exact same institution. While the galaxy reeled from the depths of their leadership, the governments of the galaxy started brokering deals to reunify, to start anew, and to force the negative institutions out of power. Whether they be the Trade Federation or the Kaminoan Labs, they needed to be dismantled and split up amongst the other smaller corporations, for fair trade and so forth. Yoda, on the other hand, would visit Tennu and then Tython, not finding Dooku at either, but eventually he would find him at Ossus. When he landed, he found a much different Dooku. The two of them would speak about where Dooku was mentally, and how he was handling the change. They were open with each other, and the sentiment displayed by Yoda revealed to Dooku that so much of his life had been missed out on because he never communicated openly to his master. They had their conversations, but they were never vulnerable enough to really explore the changes that could be made, let alone the realizations that were necessary for Dooku to reject the darkness. As they sat there, speaking sometimes, sitting silently other times, they rebuilt their relationship. It would be Yoda's great secret, because he couldn't betray his apprentice, no matter what. Dooku was the last of his students. The Council, nor Skywalker, nor the galaxy needed to know that Dooku had survived. His apparent death marked the end of the war and the beginning of celebration. And while the galaxy would be hard-pressed to actually begin its celebrations, they would come eventually. Yoda and Dooku continued to rebuild their relationship for years to come. Much of what Dooku learned made him come to regret his actions. However, in a weird way, it did bring forth the end of the Sith. Maul wouldn't be discovered because there'd be no massacre of the witches of Dathomir. This would lead to Savage getting into another altercation with Asajj Ventress, one that would end his life. With the end of the Clone Wars came the retreat of General Grievous. He would destroy his enemies in the brief war between Separatist leaders, before retreating into the unknown regions with a small fleet. They would coexist silently, trying to find their home and make their mark, until pissing off the wrong locals and getting eviscerated in a series of space battles. The Jedi would maintain their status in a new government, eventually even receiving a chance to have representatives within the Republic. Yoda, even after his conversations with Dooku, would encourage this decision. It would lead to a more neutral Jedi Order in the end, one with more political leeway and many more credits to work with because of it. The Jedi and clones would be united through a series of bills, helping both groups find their own selective peace, but giving them the option to go out into the galaxy to make a positive change for those suffering. Yoda would maintain the secret of his relationship with his former student. They'd visit infrequently, but every time they saw each other, it'd be like old friends catching up. Yoda would heal Yaddle's Kyber crystal and return it to Dooku, so that he could have a healed piece of his past. Dooku would be the last student to pass away before Yoda, and only a year following Dooku's death, Yoda would go too. The Jedi Master would have retrofit the direction of the Jedi Order, and while it would have been interpreted as more politically aligned with the Republic, it prevented oversights from Senate committees and guaranteed more credits for Jedi-run operations to assist the people of a now healing galaxy. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons. Andrew Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Django Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Colin Rooney, Shark McDory, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Snake Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Saints of Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngly Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Photos Like Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with Three First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So this is I really wanted to just focus on Dooku and Yoda's relationship. I think there's a lot of unexplored stories there. I think, I'd love to see a Tales of the Jedi with Yoda and get a lot more of the Dooku storyline there. Just to explore the relationship more, and that's what I really wanted to do here. And I think, truthfully speaking, I think the issue is, I think Dooku just thought he couldn't be open with his master. And I can understand where that comes from. Yoda is 800 years old, we see it in Revenge of the Sith, but I think these are just, really, honestly, just misinterpretations of Yoda. I think he's a really deep character, and I just kind of wanted to show that here. And I think his attachment to Dooku would honestly prevent him from killing Dooku, even when it came to it. Like, you see in that Force vision in Season 6, he doesn't want Anakin to just execute Dooku. That's for two reasons, because you don't execute somebody, but also, that's Dooku, that's his apprentice. He watched this kid grow up and turn into Tyrannus. And so, I really wanted to cover that. So I hope you all enjoyed that aspect and this story. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.